Welcome everybody, welcome to the London Archives. My name is Tom, I'm an Engagement Learning Officer here at the Archives. Welcome to those of you who joined us in person, and welcome to those of you who are joining us at home as well. As that suggests, this is a hybrid event, and as such, just a few little bits of housekeeping I need to say. For those of us in the room today, we have an elaborate danger area of booby traps here with our various cabling, so I'm going to ask people not to go near that for us. Don't anyone want to come a cropper on that. And those of you joining us at home, my colleague Rachel will be in the chat for you, so if you have any questions or problems, please feel free to pop them in the chat and we'll do our very best to help. And we'll take questions about the presentation at the end, which should last about 45 minutes, something of that order. So that being said, we can start with today's presentation, which is called Magna Carta: Myth and Meaning. And we're chatting with a few people just before we started to say that the City of London's Magna Carta is on display here at the London Archives, and actually it's the first time it's been on display here at the London Archives. It has been on display a few times at the Guildhall in the Heritage Gallery space there, most notably in 2015 to coincide with the 800th anniversary of the issuing of the first Magna Carta, which coincidentally was also about the time I started working at what was then called London Metropolitan Archive. So this is quite a nostalgic talk for me in some ways, but also a little bit alarming because it does show quite how quickly time can fly when you're having fun. And it's a fun talk as well for me this afternoon because the Magna Carta is a very famous document. I think in the text to accompany this event, I hedged my bets and said it's probably the most famous document that we have. And I was being far too mealy-mouthed there. It certainly is the most famous document we have in our collection, and arguably, I would say it's the most famous archival document in our country. I think there's a potential challenge from the Domesday Book, perhaps, but I don't think that's as well known as the Magna Carta. I don't think it's had the same impact throughout the generations and indeed to the present day. The other contender I could think of was maybe Shakespeare's first folio. Again, very important document. Perhaps you could argue with as much kind of cultural reach, but from time to time I like to be pedantic, and I think we can all agree that's really a rare book rather than a document. So I think we can safely say that it's the most famous document in certainly the British archival tradition, and possibly I think it can challenge for perhaps the most famous in the Western canon, but there maybe it gets knocked off the top spot by perhaps the US Declaration of Independence or the US Constitution. I think we could argue it either way, but the trump card with this one is we can say that the Magna Carta basically inspired those documents, as we will go on to hear. So we can conclude that it's a very important document. Hello there, welcome. It's a very famous document, but sometimes with things that are very famous, sometimes things that are quite well known to us, we can think we know more about them than perhaps we actually do. And this idea was quite nicely summarised for me when doing a bit of extra research for this talk. Actually, only this very morning, I came across a classic episode of the 1950s BBC comedy Hancock's Half Hour, and this episode is a parody of the 1957 film 12 Angry Men, in which one forthright jury foreman gradually changes the opinion of his fellow jurors. In the 1957 film and play, it's done for the most altruistic and idealistic of reasons. In this one, we get the sense that Tony Hancock's character wants to keep on getting his stipend and make the deliberations drag on. And as part of a beseech to the jury foremen, where he muddles up various other historical references, he says to them, "Does Magna Carta mean nothing to you? Did she die in vain?" And so I hope by the end of this talk we'll know a little bit more about Magna Carta. You'll be able to impress or possibly annoy your friends and family with your newfound Magna Carta knowledge. And indeed, this next section might even save you a little bit of legal trouble. So, in August 2021, one Sinead Quinn was required to pay a total of £8,436 in fines and costs after magistrates found her guilty of 10 charges relating to lockdown breaking activity in November 2020. Quinn had kept her hairdresser salon open in defiance of the lockdown rules that were present at the time. A year earlier, a small group of protesters, around 30, had gathered at Edinburgh Castle. Although reports suggest that they preferred the term seized, that they seized the castle, what they wanted to do was to take, and this is, I quote here, they wanted to take power back from the crown and defeat a fraudulent government tyranny. The years of COVID and COVID lockdowns were strange times, and people did all kinds of different and unusual things for a whole myriad of reasons. But one thing that links these two events is, in fact, Magna Carta, and in particular the activities were inspired, or certainly justified at least, by reference to the 61st article of the 1215 iteration of this very famous document. And this is the text that you can see on the screen behind me. I'm not expecting you to read it in every detail, though I will kind of draw some attention to a key passage. This is known as the security clause. It was included in the 1215 Magna Carta, basically to enforce it should King John, who we'll obviously hear much more about presently, not go along with the wishes of his barons. It was seen as legal justification for their actions, and in this idea, it really was a poor defence. The fine and the arrest of the hairdresser and the protesters indicates, and it was a sort of flimsy legal defence for at least three reasons. Firstly, in the case of Edinburgh Castle, Magna Carta is not and never has been part of Scottish law. Obviously, different legal traditions exist in the different parts and the different nations. Secondly, the original version of the historic law of the 1215 Magna Carta, which does give powers to assail and seek redress against the king. And I've highlighted these on the screen, but I'm afraid I wasn't able to highlight them on the presentation you'll have at home. So really we're interested in the third paragraph, the last couple of lines there. And these lines here basically are the barons putting words in King John's mouth, saying, "If I don't uphold my end of the bargain, you can take these actions." And distrain, if anyone's interested, that's an archaic word which means to take someone's property away. Not a word I was familiar with until I started researching this talk. So two things to say about this clause. First of all, it never made it into law. We'll hear more about the machinations of the various issues of Magna Carta later on, but it never made it into law. That's the key point. And secondly, that this clause was only ever intended to be granted to the barons themselves. It wasn't meant to be part of something that addressed the wider population. And these appeals to Magna Carta, for the various reasons that we've heard, a part of what's a bigger movement, sometimes known as the pseudo-law movement, part of this sort of this bigger phenomenon of internet myths and disinformation. Other examples include the freeman on the land idea and that of sovereign citizens. As I say, I don't usually give advice. I don't usually like to claim the expertise, but I do feel confident saying don't use this as part of your legal defence. But what I will say as well, however misguided it is as a legal strategy, I do think it says something very interesting about the Magna Carta, and it's something we will touch on and indeed explore in a bit more detail this afternoon. That it appears at strange times. Lockdown was a national crisis. COVID was a national crisis, and it's interesting that this is the thing that was reached for. This is the thing that was reached for. That this has sort of broken free, if you like, from being an interesting archival document, an interesting and sort of in some ways beautiful in terms of its materiality medieval charter, into something in the popular consciousness that we can use in times of crisis. And to sort of separate this myth and meaning, I'd like to sort of go back to the beginning to look into what it meant when it was created, why it was created, and some of the ways it sort of rolled on through the over 800 centuries since it was first first created. As you might imagine, images of the 13th century are a little hard to find. So this I think rather fun image is actually soon going to be adorning our new education suite that we have upstairs as part of 6 other sort of notable moments in London history, and in particular London history as reflected in our collections. And what we can see here, the sort of the literally purple-faced King John being beseeched by his barons. That's a word you've probably heard before, but again, just with this idea of we might have heard it, but what does it mean? Who actually was a baron? So barons were the top level in the feudal hierarchy. There were around 200 barons at the time, and of the barons, 20 of which would be described as earls, the very highest level in this sort of this feudal hierarchy. And a feudal hierarchy simply means that the king is sort of thought to sort of in effect have right to all the land, and then that's passed down through the hierarchies from earl to lord and so on as it goes through. So the king is on top of a fairly rigid hierarchical structure, and the king really has two jobs, and one more is more important than the other. The king's job is to kind of keep the peace, to make laws, and the king's job is to win wars as well. It's to sort of have kind of rule within the territory and expand and defend that territory at the same time. And King John was very bad at both of these, and it was this exasperation with King John that led to the eventual issuing of the Magna Carta. So the first Magna Carta was granted by King John on the 15th of June 1215 in Runnymede. Runnymede is a meadow on the banks of the Thames, near Staines, Egham, that kind of way, southwest London. Coincidentally, a day's march from Windsor Castle, a day's march from London, strongholds for the kind of the warring factions, and in itself it was a marshy open ground, so a bad place to fight a battle, a bad place for an ambush. So why were the barons so sort of fed up with John? Really, it goes back to the early years of King John's reign. So King John takes the throne formally in 1199 after sort of an overlap with his brother Richard the Lionheart. And one of the things that an English king was meant to do, as we heard, was fight wars, and in particular meant to fight wars in France, because at this time the distinction between sort of England or Britain, obviously which doesn't exist as a country at this point, between England and France is not the same as it is today. Today we think in terms of countries, but in the medieval period we would think more in terms of territories owned or belonging to the various sort of parts of our feudal hierarchy. And many of the English barons, earls, many of the English nobles had territory both in France and in England, stemming from the Norman conquest of the mid-11th century. So they didn't see themselves as English or French. Those are slightly anachronistic terms. They saw themselves as belonging to these regions, places like Normandy, Aquitaine, that sort of thing. And in 1204, Normandy was lost to the French king Philip II, and in 1206, Anjou, Maine, and parts of Poitou also were lost to the English crown. And it then became King John's job to get them back. He needed to fight a war to get those places back. It also meant that King John was spending a lot of time back in England, and this enabled the people of England, and particularly the nobles of England, to realise really what an unpleasant character he was. I don't normally swear in these lectures, but I forgive myself if I'm quoting. I think it was David Carpenter, famous medieval historian, just describes King John as a shit. So we get a sense of what King John is like, but we can put this into a bit more detail. So one of the big crisis of his his mid reign was his falling out with the papacy, his falling out with the Pope. In 1204, the Archbishop of Canterbury dies, and there is a sort of a three-way dispute between the Church, King John, and the Pope as who will replace him. King John is thought to be meddling in this appointment, and as part of that, falls out with the Pope, and King John is personally excommunicated by the Pope, and the country as a whole is placed under something called an interdict. You could think of an interdict as a sort of a clerical strike. Only the most basic kind of church sort of functions and rites are allowed to be carried out. Now, this is one of those things where you will read slightly different and different and in fact conflicting accounts of quite what this means. The accounts basically agree that church bells no longer could no longer ring, that various rites and sacraments couldn't be performed. Mass was not performed on a regular basis. Where the accounts start to do differ is quite which sacraments were prohibited and to what extent. You will read some accounts that suggest that baptisms weren't performed. That always struck me as a little bit surprising. To take a small detour into medieval theology, a dominant belief at the time was the idea of original sin, that babies were born in sin. Failure to baptize a baby would mean if they died, they would go to hell. And in a time of shockingly and tragically high infant mortality, this was a very important thing. So I was always slightly surprised to read these accounts that the baptism was prohibited. And digging a little deeper, it does seem that that's probably one of those things that gets repeated but isn't necessarily true. But the sort of the partial truth there, which is in some ways more interesting to me, is what the interdict prohibited was the blessing of more of the I've forgotten the proper term, but the balm, the oil that's used as part of that sacrament. And you get a situation where the English Church is trying to eke this out and keep it going longer, so dilute it more and more. They've got a supply of the consecrated balm that they can use, and they're having to sort of water that down. And as this starts to run down, this almost adds an urgency to proceedings. Eventually, in a real sort of quite impressive, if unprincipled act of chutzpah, King John solves this crisis by what's sometimes described as selling the kingdom back to the Pope. He basically agrees to the Pope's demands. He grants concessions to who the new Archbishop of Canterbury will be, and he swears fealty to the Pope. So the Pope becomes King John's new overlord, and he pays him £600. I think it's £600. I didn't make a note of that, so forgive me if that's wrong. Pays him a large sum of money in the process. This means very little in practice in terms of what King John can and can't do, but it does give him a powerful ally in the Pope. By the 13th century, this idea doesn't really have any kind of bearing on sort of politics going forward, but technically, up until Henry VIII break with the Church of Rome in the 16th century, the Pope was an overlord over the British crown. So there's interdict. This is a big problem for a very a religious society. But we also heard about war, and the other two big problems of King John's reign linked from this. So we heard that the lands in Normandy and Anjou, Maine and Poitiers were lost, and King John has to get these back. To get these lands back, he needs an army, and to have an army, he needs money. And he is famous for his ruthlessly efficient raising of taxes, often against the traditions of the time. And there's also a real element of I think personal sadism in much of his actions. He's thought to have murdered his nephew Arthur because he will be a claimant to the throne. He's famous for imprisoning and making sexual advances against the wives and children of people he's extorting money from. But nevertheless, he is the English king, and sort of the barons are sort of stuck with him up until this point. Then in 1214, there is the Battle of Bouvines, and the Battle of Bouvines is described by John France, professor of medieval history at Swansea University, as the most important battle that no one has ever heard of, because this is the battle. It's fought in Bouvines, as the name suggests, just outside, just on the French-Belgian border. This is the battle that, by losing it, makes the people of England realise they are stuck with John for good. Ironically, curiously, it's not actually sort of English forces that are involved in this battle. It's the forces of the of King John's continental ally, Count Otto, the Holy Roman Emperor. Excuse me, the Holy Roman Emperor Otto and the Counts of Flanders of Boulogne. They were meant to engage the forces of the King of France in a two-pronged attack. So Otto would be fighting them in Belgium, where and then the armies of King John would move up from the southwest, and they'd attack that way. As with many complicated plans in the field of military history, it doesn't work. Otto and the Count's army is destroyed in a rare example of a pitched battle in the high medieval period, and King John's army never makes the field. And this, what I think we can sort of draw from this, is a concern from the people in England. This is not some aberration. They are stuck with John. They have lost their lands, and they are stuck with John. And this brings matters to a head in the year 1214. And in the year 1214, we see a sort of a vying for power. We see King John trying to get people on his side because he's aware of what's to come. And this is the context to this document, which is an important sort of footnote, really, in the story of the Magna Carta. This is the 1215 Mayoralty Charter, so given to, usually called the Mayoralty Charter, given to the City of London by King John. It does a few things, confirming the rights and liberties of the City of London, but it's quite interesting and important to us here at the London Archives, because we're part of the City of London Corporation, because this is the document which gives the City of London the right to have a Lord Mayor of London. So the office of the Lord Mayor of London dates back to 1215. There was a Mayor of London before there just weren't a Lord Mayor of London. It's one of those slightly sort of technical points. But the office of the Lord Mayor of London dates back to this document. So we can see it here, and we'll go into a little bit more detail here as well. So this is the seal on the Mayoralty Charter. On the front, we can see sort of a symbolic representation of those two ideas that we've been talking about already. On the left, this is the king, something's called the king in majesty. So the king is sitting on his throne. You can see the orb and scepter. These are the sort of symbols of what's called temporal and spiritual power. And on the other side, we can see the king on horseback, showing their martial prowess. Those two roles of the king. So we talk a little bit. There we go. Yeah, we talk about the seal because it's interesting, but it is also one of these sort of myths that you hear about Magna Carta, that if you're a bit too pedantic, you can get yourself in trouble with. So if someone's being pedantic, they'll get you in trouble with it. You used to hear Magna Carta was signed by King John in June the 15th of June 1215, and you'll even see depictions of King John on a sort of in a big regal setting on a tablecloth, usually with a quill pen, signing the charter. I've got no problem with people's historical imagination. I don't really feel that sort of it's my job to kind of police people's imaginations, but this can go a bit too far. And I say it goes too far because medieval documents weren't ever signed; they were sealed. The king wouldn't sort of physically sign it as we might today. Documents were prepared by specialists, and then the royal seal was attached to it. That was how they were given their authenticity. Again, as I say, it's not for me to police kind of the sort of the layman's historical imagination, but these things can go too far. When in the 2015 commemorative coin produced by the Royal Mint, they famously had King John signing the Magna Carta, and much censure followed. So this is why you will often read in accounts Magna Carta quite sort of clumsy sentencing. Magna Carta was granted, it was given his seal, that sort of thing. It's usually hinting at people not wanting to sort of get egg on their face by saying that it was signed by King John. So we're talking around it, and soon we'll get to sort of the nuts and bolts of the Magna Carta. But at this stage, I just want to say that we tend to think of the Magna Carta in quite idealistic terms about justice and freedom, all of those things, and it does contain very important clauses to that effect. But they're also very practical, the clauses that are included in the Magna Carta. And probably the most famous example of this is the so-called fish weirs clause, which reads as follows. Clause 33, all fish weirs are in future to be entirely removed from the Thames and the Medway and throughout the whole of England except on the sea coast. So a fish weir is a weir is a dam. A fish weir is basically a fishing trap. Then there were many of these traps on the Thames, on the Medway, and they were causing problems. Partly they were meaning that not enough salmon. Many of these weirs belonged to the king. The king weirs were basically taking all the salmon, meaning they weren't able to spawn and depriving other people of their catch. Also, the weirs themselves are silting up the Thames, the Medway, making navigation difficult as well. So it just gives an example of, yes, there are legal sort of like idealistic concerns, but practical concerns as well. And this idea of the Magna Carta sort of growing in the imagination was very well captured to me by Lord Carlisle of Beru. I'm probably not saying that last bit right. My apologies. And Lord Carlisle is a British barrister and crossbench member of the House of Lords, and he was the independent review of terrorism legislation from 2001 to 2011. And he said, I'm so fed up with hearing about Magna Carta that I generally carry a copy of it with me, if only to prove to those that refer to it that it is sexist, racist and classist. It gives no guarantee other than that there will be a system of law in place if freedom is removed in any respects. And I'm absolutely confident that liberty would be marching down Whitehall in protest at Magna Carta if anything remotely like it was enacted at the present time. So it gives us a sense of some different ideas of the Magna Carta, and in the time remaining, we'll see a little bit more about what it actually says, how it says it, and how that has come down to us today. So we've been talking a lot about the 1215 Magna Carta, but the 1215 Magna Carta was very short-lived. So the 1215 Magna Carta was sealed by King John, but it was reneged on almost instantly. He didn't want to have his authority bound, and in particular, the security clause that we opened with was particularly odious to him, and indeed his ally, the Pope, was quick to condemn it from the papal pulpit. With King John's reneging of the Magna Carta, a civil war ensues. By really a quirk of fate, King John dies from dysentery early in that war, and the throne passes to his son Henry the Third. Thank you. Henry the Third. Who's only a child at this time. The civil war then continues with a French prince and brought in by the rebels, and then at this point, Henry III's regent, a man called William Marshall, takes the step of reissuing the Magna Carta, shorn of the most odious clauses, and says basically, if you fight for Henry, if you're on Henry's side, this is the king that you will be getting, and this really enables the sort of the English, the rump of the English barons and lords to defeat the French Prince Louis in this civil war. Then in 1225, and this is obviously a much later depiction that we can see, the Magna Carta is reissued, this time by Henry himself, and it's seen to be the guiding principles of his kingship. The idea is that it's issued of his own free will, so it's not under kind of concession from the barons. And as part of the issuing of this document, he's able to raise taxes. So from this point, at this point, the Magna Carta goes down from 63 to 37 clauses, and this is the Magna Carta that, as we will hear, becomes reissued. And the important reissue for us is the 1297 reissue. This is reissued by Edward I, and he issues this Magna Carta as part of a minor crisis in his reign. Compared to his forebears, Edward I is a remarkably effective king by the standards of medieval kingship. He's able to create laws in new ways. Indeed, he's sometimes known to scholars as the English Justinian, a reference to a Roman Empire himself, famed for his lawmaking. And he's very successful in his military campaigns against the Welsh and the Scots, and to a lesser extent in France as well. As I say, in a sort of really rare moment of crisis in Edward's reign, he needs to get his lords back on side. So in 1297, he reissues the Magna Carta as part of a money-raising strategy. And this is the Magna Carta that we have in our collection, and we can see it here on the screen. As well as the 1297 Magna Carta, there is a 1300 issue of Magna Carta with no changes, and there also is a copy of the text of Magna Carta copied into another document that we have, and it's an illuminated manuscript. So we can see it. We can see it here on the screen. So in real life, and those of you that have joined us today, there is a chance to see it. As I say, it's on display. Those of you who can't join us today but are within sort of striking distance of the archive, it's be on display for the rest of this month. So there's about another week of it being on display. And if that doesn't work for you, there is actually really quite a good digital version of it on our website as well. Maybe Rachel, if you have a moment, you could pop that in the chat for people. And that's where I've taken this image from as well. So it's a charter. It's made of parchment. Parchment is animal skin, very expensive but hard-wearing material, and that in part gives a sense of its stature. It's an expensive, valuable thing to make. It's a very large piece of parchment, as these things go, 50 by 40 by 40 centimeters. And despite its sort of relatively small size, it's very densely packed with text. It will take about half an hour to read out all the text included in this document. It's written in medieval Latin, which was usually official documents in this country until 1733, and it's written in a script known as Anglicana, also sometimes called charter hand or court hand. And the famous, and its most famous passage, we will see in a moment's time. Let me just remember which order I put these in the slides in. Oh no, sorry. What I wanted to say as well is our Magna Carta is special because it's one of the best conditions of the remaining 1297 Magna Cartas. That's in part because it doesn't come out very often, but it's also due to a certain amount of luck as well. This slide shows us that it's been folded up at some point. You can see the creases along the side. It was folded up and it lived in the vaults of the Bank of England during the Second World War, and we're not entirely sure who unfolded it and when, but that's not a job that I would fancy myself. You should see me try to unveil an Ordnance Survey map. So we've been talking a little bit. I've been doing a bit of been quite let's do it this way. I've skipped forward 3 slides, Rachel, sorry about that. Yeah, yeah, there we go. So I've been a bit deflationary so far about Magna Carta, sort of keen to point out what it is and sort of root it in the sort of slightly grubby politics of its time. I do not want to take that too far, because there is a very important clause in the Magna Carta, sometimes known as the Golden Passage, and it states that no free man shall be imprisoned except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land. And it goes on to say, to no one will we sell, to no one deny or delay right or justice. And on the screen here, it's basically the second line. It starts here, nullus liber homo, and so it goes. And so it goes on. And this is really where the myth-making of Magna Carta starts. But this does enshrine a very important principle, which is that the king is not sort of above the law. The king cannot make arbitrary laws. The king, although sovereign, is bound by the law. And this is the idea that will roll down through the centuries. And now I'm going to go back 2 slides, Rachel. And the reason it's able to roll down through the centuries is because the Magna Carta was widely promulgated. It was spread throughout the land. We know with the 1215 Magna Carta that 40 or 50 copies were made. It was in an era before sort of mass media, before newspapers, before social media. The way that this message was got out was by making physical copies and sending them around the country. We can't be sure, but with the scholarship suggests they were displayed variously in cathedrals, hence their survival in many kind of cathedral archives and in sort of town halls as well, such as the City Hall, I should say, really, such as the Guildhall. And on this slide here, this is some of the unique features of the 1297 Magna Carta as sent to the London Guildhall, and in particular, it refers to. We can see a reference to London at the bottom. This is a sort of a covering letter. My understanding, this is almost the scriptorium saying this is the London one, labelling them ready to go out. And on the top of the screen here, you can see a little N in the margin for nota, a little note there, and it goes on to say to talk about London. Third line across from nota, you can make out the word London, and this again is a reaffirmation, a bit like the Mayoralty Charter, of the ancient rights and liberties of the City of London. And here we see the writ or cover letter that's attached to it, and this, as I say, gives an idea of how this physical document made its way out into the world. Not just an idea of liberty, but something that's going out and being displayed. This is Edward asking for this, kind of commanding for this document to be displayed in the places that we've talked about. That's the golden clause, Rachel. So we'll go to the picture of King Charles. So from its display in kind of cathedrals across the land, it's come down to us throughout the centuries, and really it's in the 17th and then 18th centuries it mutates, if you like, from this idea of a narrow section of society protecting their liberties but also their practical concerns, to this bigger idea of it somehow guaranteeing everybody's freedom. And the context to this is the conflicts that culminate in the English Civil War of the 17th century. This comes in part from different traditions of kingship. So James I and Charles I, his son, have a different idea of what it is to be a king, drawn from the sort of Scottish prerogative tradition, a far more absolutist tradition. They think the king is the divine. Believes in the divine right of kings, that the king is God's representative on earth, and therefore his authority is not to be brooked. I won't try and do the whole kind of cause of the English Civil War in 3 sentences, but suffices to say that was countervailing to the sort of the practical, religious, and ideological concerns of an increasingly wealthy section of English society. And one of the documents that they reached for, in particular a lawyer called Edward Coke reached for to advance his arguments against the absolute position, was the Magna Carta, and various legal commentaries produced by Edward Coke. This idea of Magna Carta guaranteeing liberties emerges, and indeed so dangerous was or so threatening to this idea, thought James I. We have stories of when Edward Coke was dying on his deathbed, the king's soldiers are taking his books from him. Ed was dying upstairs, and his books are being taken away from him downstairs because they don't want this idea to get out. And the image we see on the screen here is Charles I about to be executed. So from in the 17th century through the writings of Edward Coke and a few important others as well, Magna Carta sort of mutates, becomes something that is sought to apply to everybody, or certainly to every man of a certain stature or religion. And then from there it makes another important leap. Edward Coke and others are important in formulating the state constitutions of the early colonies of the United States of America, and then and this idea of sovereign being bound by law, that people are offered protection by the law, is obviously a very important idea. It feeds into the American War of Revolution, and then it's framed in the Constitution as well. In 1689, there is a Bill of Rights, an English Bill of Rights, and is part of the machinations following the so-called Glorious Revolution. And this Bill of Rights inspires the Bill of Rights that becomes the first 10 amendments of the United States Constitution. So the Magna Carta is, I don't think it's too strong to say, revered in certain sort of legal and sort of libertarian circles in the United States. So it's fitting then in 1957 that the American Bar Association paid for this monument, this memorial. So this is at Runnymede, where the Magna Carta was signed. It's a temple. It's a sort of the idea is it's a classical temple of liberty, and it's hard to make out, but it says to commemorate Magna Carta, democracy and freedom under law. So we have these ideas that come through the American Constitution, and then in turn they feed into the the United Nations Charter of Human Rights and other documents as well. We'll just and it's really now something of as a footnote. We might reflect on what Magna Carta means for. What Magna Carta means for now and for the future. The first thing to say, linking back to how we started our presentation, is that the Magna Carta is more symbolic than legal. In fact, only 3 clauses still remain of the Magna Carta on the statute books. These are clauses relating to the freedom of the Church of England, the city of London, and the Golden Passage that we looked at earlier. Everything else has been variously taken out or subsumed into other legislation, a lot of which happened in the first half of the 19th century, into the Georgian and early Victorian periods. Hence the illustration of the Parliament before it burnt down in the fires, the old houses of Parliament. And as I say, Magna Carta has a way of sort of appearing and sort of informing discussion at sort of very difficult times. So on the screen here is an image of the memorial to the 7/7 bombing in London. And obviously part of a very difficult episode in London and the country's, indeed the world's history of terrorism, attacking civilians, and real concerns about how to balance the liberty of individual citizens versus the kind of the powers required to investigate and prevent such atrocities. And Magna Carta was something that was referenced again and again at this time. Indeed, the earlier quote that I read from its name from the independent commissioner of the independent reviewer of terrorist legislation, that quote of decrying Magna Carta was in reference to it being used in these debates. One of the key concerns was the idea of habeas corpus, how long you can detain someone without trial. Magna Carta was used in that debate, even though Magna Carta makes no reference to habeas corpus. And then now to the present day, and to this year, to another very live, potentially distressing political issue. And I just want to get my notes right for this one. In May of this year, some of you may remember that the Magna Carta on display in the British Library was attacked. I mean, to be more accurate, I suppose the case that contains it was attacked, and this is part of the Extinction Rebellion and Just Stop Oil campaigns to draw attention to the dangers of catastrophic climate change. And one Reverend Parfitt, who alongside Mrs. Bruce wielded the hammer and chisel used to attack the case, said, "The Magna Carta is rightly revered, being of great importance to our history, to our freedoms and to our laws. But there'll be no freedom, no lawfulness, no rights if we allow climate breakdown to become the catastrophe that now threaten us." And so they go on for a call to actions. And what's interesting here is not And what's interesting to me here is, first of all, that Magna Carta has been once again sort of singled out in as a time of distress, but also the other kind of cultural treasures that have been, ironically, perversely, you might say, sort of deemed worthy of attack in these in this campaign. Of course, sunflowers, which have made news recently, and Stonehenge as well. To me, this underlines the importance of Magna Carta, not just something from medieval times, but as an important and sort of touchstone of our history today. And on that note, I'll thank you for your attention. Jolly good. So there are time for questions now. So the questions from the room or questions at home, I'm happy to take them. We'll start with questions from the room, because there's usually a little bit of a delay on the stream at home. So that just makes that a bit easier. So are there any questions? Yes.
Yes, it was just to go back. I didn't quite catch. You mentioned when William Marshall reissues it.
Yes.
Of his own bat, essentially, when he's reissued it for Henry III. I think you mentioned it was he reissued it shorn of it, something like most of.
Odious, I think I probably said. I was feeling flowery. Yes.
No, please do. Was those specifically clauses that would be deemed odious to the king?
Yes, that's right. I'll just repeat the question, because I'm not sure how well this picks up the room. So the question was referring to the reissue of the Magna Carta in 1217 as part of the Civil War. Said it was shorn of its most odious clauses. To whom were those clauses odious? And the answer was the king. So most famously, the securities clause that we opened with. That was seen as a step too far. Thank you. Other questions or comments? Anything from home, Rachel? No, we'll give it a moment, because sometimes there's a little bit of a delay. And just to reiterate, it is on display, so please do have a look if you're here in person. So you just come through the doors and turn left, and sort of then round the corner and be there. If you are at home today and would like to sit and you are able to join us, we're open Monday to Thursday. So we're not open to the public on a Friday for readers, but Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday next week, please do come and have a look. Or failing that, it is available online. Are there any questions from at home, Rachel?
I do actually have one. This is I quite understand if this is tricky to answer, but was England unique in Western Europe in Magna Carta, or was there anything comparable roughly around the time in other countries?
Good. Okay, so
territories?
Yeah. So the question was England unique? Was England unique in issuing Magna Carta at this time? I'm going to give a slightly hedged answer to this and say I don't know, but we like to think that we are. I'm going to put it like that. So I'm not aware that there was, but I tend to be a bit parochial in my knowledge, as you might expect from what I do. But I think you're hitting on something actually really very important about Magna Carta. It's part of this story that we like to tell ourselves about the sort of the rise of English liberty, of universalism and human rights. And I don't want to sort of abuse my sort of power of the pulpit and get too political. I think there's some truth in that. I don't think it's always as true as we like to think it is, and there are some dark sides to it as well. And so Magna Carta is a really important part of that sense of ourselves and that sense of an English tradition, whatever your personal kind of beliefs are about that. Thank you. That seems like a fitting note to end on, I think. Oh, no, it's okay, it's okay.
So, did it come completely out of the blue in 1215? I mean, in that, had there been previous petitions to the king that the king had to sign, or was it suddenly we get this really dodgy king and they come up with this idea?
That's a really good question. So the question was, did it come out of the blue? Was it novel, or were there other things similar? Did we have a really dodgy king and then this appears? A bit of both, I would say. So the idea that the king should behave himself is not new. Indeed, the oldest document we have in our collection is a charter from 1067, call it the William Charter, and that's much smaller. It's about the size of the cover, the cover on the Magna Carta, and that is King William saying, paraphrasing, I will be a good king, I will respect your laws and traditions, I will respect your property. So that in itself is not new. And indeed, there is an idea at this time that lasts really, I think, throughout the medieval ages and further on, really, that what is being protected in something like Magna Carta. It's not a novelty, it's a calling back to an ancient tradition that we all know, a sense of liberty, fair play. Some historians link that back to the common law of the German tribes that come over following the Roman Empire. So it's not a new idea. But I think its formulation in quite this way is novel. This very sort of assertive attempt to overpower the king, I think, is somewhat novel, and certainly the scholarship suggests that this idea that the king we can bind the king through the law, I think that is the novelty. But the idea of having some kind of charter or treaty with the king is not entirely novel. You're welcome. No more questions from home? Jolly good. Well, thank you everyone for coming along. It's a fun one to talk